With all due
A
respect,
son-in-law
sir,
stands up, raises
you're
his
the reason
champagne
people
glass,
stay poor.
and says to his father-in-law in front of 200 guests, "With all due respect, sir, you're the reason people stay poor." The room went silent. Then, laughter. Not the nervous kind, the real kind, the kind that means everyone agrees. And the old man? He just sat there, quiet, folded hands on the table, a small smile on his face that nobody could read. Fast forward 3 years. That same son-in-law, the one with the champagne, the startup worth $40 million, the confidence of a man who thought God owed him something, was standing on that old man's doorstep.
Please, I have nowhere
No
else to
car,
go. After
no
what you
lawyer,
did,
no
get off my
backup plan.
porch. I'm
Just a
begging you.
broken man knocking on the door of the person he humiliated. Now here's the question that should be sitting in your chest right now. What did that old man do when he opened that door? Stay with me, because this story is not just about revenge. It's about something much older and much more dangerous than revenge. It's about patience.
Before we go any further, if you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or dismissed by someone who thought your silence meant weakness, drop a comment right now. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. You do not want to miss where this goes.
His name was Aldrich Beaumont. 63 years old, originally from Shreveport, Louisiana, moved to California 40 years ago with $40 in his pocket, a borrowed suitcase, and a name nobody out west knew how to pronounce. By the time his only daughter, Lorianne, was born, Aldrich had built something quiet, not flashy, not loud, the kind of wealth that doesn't post itself online, the kind that sits in accounts most people don't know exist, in businesses most people have never heard of, in handshakes that don't get photographed. But here's the thing about Aldrich Beaumont. He never told anyone. Not his neighbors in the modest Pasadena neighborhood where he chose to live. Not the men at his Thursday evening card game. Not even his daughter, fully, completely, the way you'd expect a father to tell a child. Why? Because Aldrich had a philosophy, one he carried like a stone in his shirt pocket, close to his chest, always. Money tells you who a man is trying to be. Silence tells you who he already is. He wore the same watch for 20 years, a Seiko. Not the expensive kind, the kind you buy at a department store. He drove a 2009 Buick that his son-in-law once described as a rolling apology. He cut his own grass on Saturdays, he cooked red beans and rice every Sunday, and left the door open for neighbors who might need a plate. And he watched. Aldrich Beaumont watched everything. Now, let's talk about Devlin Hargrove. Because every story about a quiet man starts with a loud one. Devlin was 34 when he married Lorianne Beaumont in that Newport Beach ballroom, Stanford MBA tech startup called Axiom Reach that had just closed its Series A round at $80 million, 6'2", jawline that belonged on a magazine cover, the kind of man who walked into rooms like he'd already been told he was the most important person in them. Lorianne had met him at a fundraiser in Santa Monica. He was giving a speech about disrupting legacy industries. She was there for the free wine and ended up staying for him. She called her father the next morning. "Daddy, I met someone." Aldrich asked 2 questions. That was his way. Always 2, never more. "Is he kind? Is he honest?" Lorianne laughed. "He's brilliant, Daddy." Aldrich didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "That's not what I asked, baby girl." But Lorianne was 29 and in love, and sometimes love is louder than wisdom. She married Devlin Hargrove 8 months later. And Aldrich Beaumont? He paid for the entire wedding, $240,000. He wrote the check without blinking, didn't tell a soul how much it cost, and sat in the front row with his Seiko watch and his department store suit, crying quietly when his daughter walked down the aisle. Devlin noticed the suit. You could tell by the way his eyes moved, quick, calculating. When he shook Aldrich's hand at the altar, that was the first insult, and it hadn't even been spoken yet. The reception was where it started, really started. The dinner tables were full, the speeches were done, the champagne was flowing in the kind of volume that makes men say things they've been holding for months. Devlin's business partner, a fast-talking man from San Francisco named Whitaker Pruce, leaned over during dessert and said loudly enough for the table to hear, "Dev, Is that your father-in-law? The one with the Buick in the parking lot? Devlin glanced over at Aldrich, who was talking softly to an elderly woman, one of Lorienne's aunts. That's him. What does he do? Devlin smiled. The wrong kind of smile. Retirement, I think. Odd jobs before that. Nothing significant. Whitaker laughed. And something small and irreversible happened in that moment. A decision got made. Not a spoken one, but the kind that gets made in the chest, the kind that shapes how a man treats another man for years. Then, 2 hours later, glasses raised, guests watching, Devlin stood up for what he called a personal toast. He looked straight at Aldrich. I want to say something to my father-in-law. Sir, I have a lot of respect for your generation. You worked hard, you sacrificed, and I say this with love, the reason most families like yours never break into real wealth is because you prioritize relationships over results, family over finance. He smiled, smooth, polished. With all due respect, you're the reason people stay poor, and I intend to make sure your daughter never has to think the way you taught her. Laughter. Applause even. Lorienne's face went the colour of the tablecloth. She touched her father's arm under the table. Aldrich Beaumont looked at his son-in-law. Not with anger, not with hurt, with something quieter and far more permanent. He lifted his water glass. To family, he said simply, and drank. The years that followed were Devlin's years. There's no other way to say it. From the outside, from any rational, observable angle. Devlin Hargrove was winning. Axiom Reach grew from 18 million to 65 million in valuation inside 18 months. Tech press called him the architect of next-generation consumer intelligence. He was on the cover of a West Coast business magazine. He bought a house in Bel Air. 6 bedrooms, rooftop pool, a driveway long enough that the gate felt like a country border. Lorienne quit her marketing job to run the household, the charities, the public-facing life of a man who was building a brand as much as a company. And Aldrich visited twice a year, Christmas and Lorienne's birthday. He drove the Buick. He brought Louisiana pralines from a small shop in Pasadena that Lorienne had loved since childhood. He sat in the big living room with its 14-foot ceilings and its designer furniture, and he looked like exactly what Devlin told people he was. A man from a different time, a different world. Devlin's friends had a name for him, not to his face, but in group chats, in sideline whispers at the parties Aldrich never attended. The Relic. Devlin's COO, a hard-edged woman from Houston named Brixton Calloway, once asked Devlin half seriously, "Does your father-in-law own property? Or is Lorienne going to be supporting him eventually?" Devlin waved a hand. "He's got a little house in Pasadena. I've offered to upgrade him. He said no." "He said no to a house?" "He said," Devlin mimicked an older southern accent badly, "I don't need what I didn't build." Brixton laughed. Devlin laughed harder. In Pasadena, Aldrich was watching his favorite documentary about migratory birds and eating red beans and rice. He was also, quietly, unhurriedly, making 3 phone calls that would matter enormously in about 20 months. But we'll get to that. The damage to Lorienne started in year 2. Because Devlin was smart, truly smart. And smart men who go bad don't attack what you love directly. They erode it, slowly. The way water erodes stone. Not with force, but with consistency. It started with comments. "Your father called again. 3rd time this week. You need to manage that." "Lorienne, I love the man, but he talks about the past like it's an instruction manual. The world moved on." "Did he really tell you to remind me to call my mother? We're not children. Small things, individually dismissible, collectively. A campaign. And slowly, the way children forget the smell of their childhood home after they've been gone long enough, Lorienne began to see her father through Devlin's eyes. Not fully, not all at once, but in the way that matters. In the small hesitations before she picked up his calls. In the slight embarrassment when Devlin's partners came to dinner and her father was also there. In the way she once said, softly, guiltily, "Daddy, you don't have to give advice about things you don't understand." Aldrich had driven 4 hours round trip to bring her birthday pralines and spend an afternoon with her. He drove home that night in his Buick and called his old friend Cornelius Vane, a man who'd known him since their 20s in Shreveport. "She's disappearing, Cornelius." Cornelius, who had watched many things over many decades, said, "She'll come back. They always come back, Al. Question is, what shape the house is in when they do." Aldrich was quiet. "I'm making sure the house is ready," he said finally. Cornelius laughed. But not the way Whitaker Pruce laughed, the way old men laugh when they know something young men haven't learned yet. Now, here's where the story shifts. Because we've been watching Devlin rise, and that's been easy to follow. Money, press, arrogance, success, a story we've all seen versions of. But what were you watching while Devlin was making covers? This is the part most people miss. Aldrich Beaumont did not become what he was by accident. Before Lorianne was born, before California, before the Buick and the Seiko and the Thursday card games, there was a younger Aldrich who had worked under a man named Prescott Ryland in New Orleans. Prescott Ryland was a commercial real estate developer in an era before commercial real estate became the thing everyone talked about. He was also a man who understood something radical for his time, that the most valuable businesses are the ones nobody is watching. He taught Aldrich 3 things. 1. If everyone knows what you own too little. 2. Patience is not waiting. Patience is building while everyone thinks you've stopped. 3. The man who controls the water doesn't have to announce the drought. Aldrich had spent 40 years applying those lessons. He owned. Quietly, through holding companies with names that meant nothing to anyone who might Google them. A minority stake in a logistics company based in Dallas that moved goods for 4 major retail chains. He held silent equity in 2 regional banks, both in the South. He had invested early, absurdly early, through a private vehicle connected to Cornelius Vane's family office, in fiber optic infrastructure in the Southwest. None of this was secret in a criminal sense. It was simply private. Structured carefully, built over decades by a man who had no need to prove his worth at dinner tables or in business magazines. His net worth, as calculated by the firm in Houston that managed his affairs, sat at just over $62 million. $62 million. While Devlin Hargrove was calling him a relic. While Lorianne was apologizing for his advice. While Whitaker Pruce was laughing about the Buick. But here's what you need to understand. And this is the part of the story that separates Aldrich Beaumont from every revenge fantasy you've ever seen. He was never going to use it to hurt anyone, not unless something made it necessary. He'd built that life not to weaponize it. He built it because he believed deeply, completely in the thing Devlin had mocked him for at that wedding reception. Family. Not as a sentiment, as a structure, as the only architecture that actually holds when everything else falls. He had wanted nothing more than for Devlin to be a good husband to his daughter. He had wanted to be wrong about the look in that young man's eyes at the altar. He had wanted more than anything to sit at Christmas dinners for the next 30 years, eat well, laugh loudly, and watch grandchildren run around that Bel Air house. He prayed for that. He actually prayed. But Devlin Hargrove was not finished making decisions. The 3rd year began with what the tech press called Axiom reaches power season. The company raised a Series C round, $90 million. Devlin was everywhere. TED stage, podcast circuits, a weekend profile in a national magazine that described him as the rare founder who thinks in decades. He hired aggressively. He expanded to Austin and Miami. He moved Axiom's headquarters to a building in downtown Los Angeles that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. He also started spending in ways that even Brixton Calloway, his own COO, quietly flagged. A 40-foot yacht docked in Marina del Rey. A Scottsdale vacation property purchased off-market. A watch collection that required its own insured storage unit. "Dev," Brixton said in one of their closed-door Monday meetings, Our burn rate," Devlin said, leaning back in his chair, "is the cost of being the company that wins. You don't get to the top being cautious." Brixton had been in tech long enough to recognize that sentence. It was the sentence founders said right before things got interesting. She started updating her resume that afternoon. Quietly. She told no one. What Devlin didn't know What nobody in his orbit knew was that 3 of his major institutional investors had, over the previous 6 months, been in contact with a Houston-based advisory firm. A firm that sat, organizationally, 4 holding companies away from a man in Pasadena who drove a Buick. The calls had been quiet, informational, the kind of due diligence conversations that happen in finance all the time and mean nothing until they mean everything. The questions asked were gentle, technical, reasonable. What's your current read on Axiom's governance structure? Have you seen any variance between their reported and operational metrics? How is the founder's decision-making been characterized internally since the Series C close? Gentle questions, reasonable questions, questions that, when asked by the right people in the right tone, begin to shift the way large institutions think about risk. The call that started it all, the one that mattered, had happened 8 months earlier. Aldrich Beaumont sitting in his Pasadena kitchen. Sunday evening, red beans on the stove, the smell of bay leaf and andouille sausage filling the whole house. He'd been watching. Not plotting, not scheming. Watching. The way he always watched. He'd watched his daughter flinch at her own father's voice. He'd watched a man on television take credit for building something on top of a family foundation he'd publicly mocked. He'd watched Lorianne lose weight and gain silence and stop laughing the way she'd laughed before. He picked up the phone and called Cornelius Vane. "Cornelius, you still have that relationship at Meridian Capital?" "I do. I need a conversation. Nothing aggressive, just a conversation." Cornelius was quiet for a beat. "Al, you sure?" Aldrich looked at the photo on his kitchen wall. Lorianne at 6 years old, gap-toothed, covered in mud, holding a crawfish she'd caught herself, grinning like she'd discovered fire. "I'm sure," he said. "All right, I'll make the call." Aldrich hung up, stirred his beans, watched the steam rise. Outside in Bel Air, Devlin Hargrove was posting a photo of the yacht on his private Instagram. Caption, "Built different." Nobody knew. Nobody knew that the quiet man in Pasadena had just done the most dangerous thing a patient man can do. He'd decided it was time. It started with an email. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind with bold subject lines and legal letterhead. Just a short clinical note from Meridian Capital's portfolio management team to Devlin Hargrove's CFO, a nervous, meticulous man named Tolliver Bragg, requesting a routine governance review ahead of Axiom Reach's planned Series D raise. Tolliver read the email 3 times. Then he walked into Devlin's office and closed the door behind him. "Meridian wants a governance review." Devlin didn't look up from his laptop. "That's standard. Handle it." "Dev." Tolliver's voice had a texture to it, the kind that makes people look up. "They're asking for board minutes going back 18 months, operational variance reports, founder decision logs." Now, Devlin looked up. "That's not standard." "No," Tolliver said carefully. "It's not." The silence in the room lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds during which Devlin Hargrove ran the full calculation. The yacht, the Scottsdale property, the watch storage unit, the decisions Brixton Calloway had quietly flagged before she updated her resume, and disappeared, and arrived at a number he didn't like. "Get the lawyers on it," he said, voice still controlled, still the founder, still the man from the magazine. But his left hand, flat on the desk, had gone very still. What happened next happened fast, the way financial unravelings always do. Slowly, slowly, then, all at once, like a man falling asleep at the wheel. Meridian's review triggered a clause in the shareholder agreement that Devlin's original attorneys, the cheap ones he'd used in year 1 before the money came, had buried in page 47 of a document nobody reread after signing. The clause allowed for a confidence review by the 2 largest institutional shareholders if operational metrics deviated more than 15% from Series C projections over 2 consecutive quarters. They had, Devlin knew they had. He'd managed the narrative around it brilliantly. Or so he'd thought. With projections, pivots, and the kind of confident founder storytelling that tech press ate like candy. But Meridian wasn't tech press. And they were not alone. Vantage Growth Partners, Axiom's second largest institutional backer, sent their own letter 4 days later, Different tone, shorter, more direct. We are initiating a formal review of executive stewardship. Devlin read the phrase executive stewardship and felt something he hadn't felt since he was 22 and failing his first startup. The specific cold of panic hitting warm confidence. He called his attorney, Reginald Foss, a sharp-suited man from Beverly Hills who charged $600 an hour and was worth every cent. Reg, talk to me. Reginald Foss talked for 45 minutes, and when he finished, the summary was this. 2 major investors moving simultaneously in coordinated language meant someone had been talking to someone. This was not organic concern. This was organized pressure. Someone is pulling strings, Dev. Someone with enough access and enough standing to get 2 institutional funds moving in the same direction at the same time. Who? Reginald paused. That's what I'd be asking. Devlin asked. He had people ask. He spent real money asking. It took 11 days. 11 days before a forensic financial consultant named Waverly Cross, hired out of a firm in Century City, traced the thread back through a Houston advisory firm, through a family office in the South, through a holding company with a name that meant nothing, to a man in Pasadena, with a Seiko watch and a 2009 Buick. Waverly Cross sat across from Devlin Hargrove, in the conference room of a building that cost more per square foot than most annual salaries, and slid a single printed page across the table. At the top of the page was a name, Aldrich Beaumont. Devlin stared at it. He stared at it the way a man stares at something his brain is refusing to process. "That's my father-in-law," he said. "Yes," Waverly said. "He's retired. He lives in Pasadena. He drives a... He has controlling interest in a Houston advisory firm that manages approximately $62 million in diversified private assets." Waverly tapped the paper. "He's been a silent stakeholder in Meridian Capital's parent fund for over a decade. He has a relationship with the managing partner at Vantage that goes back to the 90s. The room got very quiet. "He didn't cause your problems," Waverly said, with the careful neutrality of someone paid to report facts, "but he made sure the people who discovered them had every reason to act on them." Devlin's world came apart in stages. First the investors, then the press. Because in Silicon Valley and its Southern California cousins, money and narrative are the same organism. When the money gets nervous, the narrative curdles. When the narrative curdles, the talent leaves. Brixton Calloway had been gone for 2 months already. 3 senior engineers followed in the same week. Then Axiom's head of product, a brilliant, quietly essential woman named Odalis Trent, resigned via a 3-line email that Devlin read standing in his kitchen at 6 a.m, coffee going cold in his hand. He called her. She didn't answer. He called Whitaker Pruce, his partner, his ally, the man who'd laughed about the Buick at the wedding reception. Whitaker answered on the 3rd ring. "Dev, I've been meaning to call you." The sentence had a sound to it, the sound of a door about to close. "Tell me you're not pulling out, Whit." Silence. "I have a fiduciary responsibility to my own investors." "Whitaker." "Dev, I'm sorry, my attorneys will be in touch with Tolliver." The call ended. Devlin stood in his Bel Air kitchen. 14-foot ceilings, designer everything, rooftop pool visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass. And for the first time in 3 years, he had no next move fully formed. The next 4 weeks were the kind that age men. Legal fees consumed cash reserves. A vendor in Austin filed a breach of contract claim. The Series D conversations, which had been described in press as all but confirmed, went cold. Devlin's publicist, a woman named Tallulah Wick, who had built his public image with surgical precision for 2 years, sent a short professional email saying she was stepping back from the engagement to focus on other clients. He sold the watch collection, then the Scottsdale property. The yacht took longer to move. Lorianne found out on a Wednesday. Not from Devlin. He was still managing the information, still convinced he could reverse engineer a recovery, still the founder even when the company was dissolving beneath him like sugar in rain. She found out from a former colleague who sent her a link to a financial news piece with the subject line, "Thought you should know." She sat at the kitchen table in the Bel Air house and read the article twice. Axiom reach in freefall. Governance failures and investor exodus raise questions about founders' future. She put her phone face down on the table. She thought about her father's voice, the last time she'd heard it. 3 weeks ago, briefly, a Sunday call she cut short because Devlin was in the room. She thought about a sentence she hadn't let herself think about in 2 years. Is he kind? Is he honest? She picked the phone back up. She called her father. He answered on the second ring. Lorianne. Just her name, the way he'd always said it. Not as information, but as a complete sentence. Like her name alone was enough to mean, "I'm here, I see you. You're mine." She didn't say anything for a long moment. "Daddy." "I know, baby girl." "Did you—" She stopped, started again. "Did you know this was going to happen?" The pause was long enough to be its own answer. "I knew," Aldrich said quietly, "that a man who treats people as disposable eventually runs out of people." Lorianne pressed her hand over her eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you needed to see it yourself, not because I pointed." She was crying now, silently, the way women cry when they've been holding something for too long. "I'm sorry, Daddy, for how I—" "Don't," he said, gently but firmly. "You don't owe me sorry. You owe yourself better choices going forward, that's all." The Bel Air house sold 2 months later. Short sale. The bank handled it. Devlin moved into a rented apartment in Culver City. 2 bedrooms, street parking, a view of a parking structure. Lorianne moved back to her father's house in Pasadena. Not because she had to, but because it was the only place that felt like ground. Aldrich made up her old room exactly the way it had been when she left. Same quilt, same lamp, same photo of her at 6, gap-toothed, holding the crawfish. He cooked red beans and rice the night she arrived. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything, actually. He just put a plate in front of her and sat across the table and let the smell of bay leaf and andouille fill up the quiet. Sometimes the best things a parent can say are the things they don't. 3 weeks after Lorianne came home, there was a knock at the door. A Sunday evening, just past 7. Aldrich was in his chair watching television. The Migratory Birds documentary was on again, a different episode, when Lorianne came into the room. "Daddy." Something in her voice made him mute the television. "It's Devlin." He didn't rush. That was the thing about Aldrich Beaumont, that people who didn't know him always underestimated. He didn't rush anything. He turned off the television. He set down the remote. He stood up slowly, the way men in their 60s stand. With intention. With the accumulated weight of everything they've survived. He walked to the front door. He opened it. Devlin Hargrove was standing on the porch of the Pasadena house. Not the Devlin from the magazine cover. Not the Devlin from the wedding reception with his champagne glass and his Stanford confidence and his voice that could fill a ballroom. This Devlin was thinner. The jaw was the same, but everything around it had changed. His clothes were fine. Old habits. But they hung differently. His eyes, which had always moved fast and calculating, were still. He was holding nothing. No briefcase, no phone in hand, no props. Just a man on a porch. "Sir." One word. And in that one word, if you were listening the way Aldrich listened, was the entire distance between who Devlin had been and who he was standing there trying to become. Aldrich looked at him. Not with triumph, not with coldness. With the particular expression of a man who has been waiting for a moment and finds, when it arrives, that it feels nothing like he imagined. "Come in," Aldrich said. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Lorianne had cried on the phone, the same table where Aldrich had stirred his beans and made the call to Cornelius Vane. Lorianne stood in the doorway for a moment, then quietly disappeared. Devlin looked around the kitchen, the small house, the ordinary everything, the photo of Lorianne with the crawfish. He looked at it for a long moment. "She looks like you," he said finally. "Same eyes." Aldrich said nothing. Devlin pressed his palms flat on the table. "I need help. The sentence cost him something. You could see it cost him something. My attorneys found out about the advisory firm, the connections. I know they did. You could have destroyed me publicly. You could have... I'm not interested in destroying you, Aldrich said. Simply, the way he said most things. Devlin looked at him. Then what were you interested in? Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and went silent. Protecting my daughter, he said. Not from hardship. Hardship makes people from a life with a man who was going to take her so far from herself that she wouldn't find her way back. Something moved across Devlin's face. Not shame exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a man who is hearing a true thing and has no defense against it. I was wrong, Devlin said. At the wedding, what I said. Yes. I've been wrong about a lot. Yes. The directness of it. No cushioning, no absolution offered cheaply. Made Devlin look up. Are you going to help me? He asked. Aldrich looked at his son-in-law, the man who had stood in a ballroom full of people and told 200 guests that his values made people poor. The man who had dismantled his daughter's relationship with her own father, one small comment at a time, over 3 years. He looked at him for a long time. That depends on you, Aldrich said finally. Not on what you need right now, on what you're willing to do differently. Devlin nodded slowly. What does that look like? It looks like starting over, not with investors, with your wife, with the person you spent 3 years teaching to doubt her own father. Aldrich leaned forward slightly. Money I can help you rebuild. Character is your own work. The kitchen was very quiet. And Devlin. Yes, sir. The Buick in my driveway. Aldrich's eyes held the faintest thing. Not quite a smile, but a cousin of one. It's paid off. Has been for 15 years. I chose it. Everything I have, I chose it. You do well to understand the difference between a man who can't afford better and a man who doesn't need to prove anything. Devlin looked at the table. I understand, he said quietly. No, Aldrich said. Not yet. But you will. Now. Here's the ending most people expect. Devlin walks out restored. Lorianne forgives completely. Everything wraps in a bow. The music swells. That's not what happened. What happened was slower and more real and more valuable. Devlin left that night with nothing resolved and nothing promised. Just a direction. A starting point. He called Lorianne from the car outside. She answered. He didn't make speeches. He didn't promise. He asked one question. Can I take you to dinner? Not to talk about the company or the lawyers or any of it. Just dinner, if you're willing. She was quiet for a long moment. Tuesday, she said. He said, Tuesday. And that was the beginning of the actual work. Aldrich Beaumont connected Devlin. 6 weeks later, after watching, after observing, after asking 2 questions and listening to the answers, to a mid-sized operations consulting firm in Dallas that needed a sharp strategic mind with tech sector experience. Not a CEO role, an advisory position, meaningful but humble in scope. The kind of role where a man rebuilds credibility before he rebuilds power. Devlin took it without negotiation. Something in Aldrich relaxed when he heard that. Cornelius Vane called on a Thursday evening the way he always did. So, how'd it end? Aldrich was in the backyard. The evening air in Pasadena in October has a specific quality. Cool but not cold, the smell of jasmine from somewhere nearby, the distant sound of the freeway humming under everything like a low note. It's not ended, Aldrich said. That's the point. He came back, though. They always come back, Cornelius. Question is, what shape the house is in when they do. Cornelius laughed. The long, knowing laugh of an old man who has watched the wheel turn many times. You said that to me 20 years ago about something else. Still true. Al, you could have just told him who you were, day one, shown him the numbers, made him respect you. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. Respect built on numbers isn't respect, he said. It's calculation. I don't want a son-in-law who treats me well because of what I own. I want one who treats people well because of who he is. And you think he can get there? I think he's trying. A pause. Trying is enough to start with. The last scene happened on a Sunday. 4 months after the knock on the door. 4 months of Tuesday dinners and difficult conversations and slow rebuilding. Lorianne had moved back to an apartment of her own. Not back with Devlin, not yet, maybe not for a long time. But the silence between them was no longer the kind that walls people off, it was the kind that gives people room. She came to her father's house on Sunday, the way she'd started coming again. Every week, without fail, without apology, like reclaiming a habit she should never have given up. She brought crawfish, not from Louisiana, from a place in Pasadena that did a reasonable job. She and Aldrich sat on the back porch while the pot boiled and the evening came in slow and orange over the San Gabriel Mountains. Daddy, did you always know about him from the beginning? Aldrich looked out at his small backyard, the grass he cut himself on Saturdays, the bird feeder he'd built from a kit 10 years ago that was slightly crooked and entirely functional. I knew he was someone who hadn't been required to grow up yet, he said. Some men are like that. They move fast enough that life never catches them long enough to teach them anything. And now life caught him. Lorianne nodded slowly. Are you angry, still, about the wedding? Aldrich turned and looked at his daughter. The same eyes, she'd had them since she was 6 and gap-toothed and covered in mud. Baby girl, he said. A man who mocks you in public is just telling you where he is, not where you are. I never needed him to know my value. I already knew it. She leaned her head on his shoulder. The crawfish pot bubbled. The mountains caught the last of the light. And in that backyard in Pasadena, with the jasmine smell and the distant freeway hum and the slightly crooked bird feeder, nothing was perfectly resolved. Nothing was fully healed. Nothing was wrapped in a clean bow. But something was true, something was solid, something held. The house was ready. It had always been ready. The end. Before you go, one question, one real one. Is there an Aldrich Beaumont in your life, someone you may have underestimated, dismissed, or taken for granted? Who stayed quiet and stayed ready while you figured yourself out? If there is, call them. Not to explain, not to apologize with a speech, just call them. Because some doors don't stay open forever, and the ones that do, they deserve to be walked through while there's still time. If this story hit different, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe. Because every week we tell stories worth feeling. This has been The Quiet Man. Thank you for staying till the end. Silence is not surrender. Aldrich never raised his voice, never issued threats, never mounted a public defense of himself. He operated from a place so grounded that humiliation couldn't find purchase. Real security doesn't need applause. The way you treat people in your season of power writes the check your season of need will have to cash. Devlin's arrogance wasn't just morally wrong. It was strategically catastrophic. Every person he dismissed, every relationship he devalued became a gap in the wall when the pressure came. How you treat people on the way up determines who is standing when you come down.